Well, some considered the recent by-election in Toronto St. Paul's a referendum on Justin Trudeau. The Conservatives managed to flip a riding that was a long-time Liberal stronghold. And so over the next couple of days, we're going to take a deep dive into the men who are currently vying for Canada's top job. Today, we will be joined by Andrew Lawton. He's the author of the biography Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life. And tomorrow, we'll be joined by the author of a book all about the life and legacy of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Now, as always, we want to hear from you today. How do you think your life in Saskatchewan would be different under Pierre Poilievre, a Pierre Poilievre Conservative government? You can call us at 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Well, our first guest today is going to help us dig into the life of Pierre Poilievre, a man who's been positioning himself to be the next Prime Minister of Canada. Andrew Lawton is managing editor of True North Media and a former host on Global News Radio. His book, Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life, explores the almost 2 decades Poilievre spent as an MP before becoming Conservative leader. Andrew, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hey, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me, Alicia. And just as a warning, like 5 minutes ago, I got a tornado warning alert on my phone. So if I start spinning around furiously midway through the show, you should probably go to commercial.
Okay, deal. Okay, we also have someone in our Saskatoon studio. Hopefully, we have no tornado warnings today here in Saskatoon. We've got U of S political science professor Daniel Westlake. He's here to talk about the relationship between Saskatchewan politics and the federal Conservative Party led by Pierre Poilievre. Daniel, welcome back to Blue Sky.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, and I do hope people call in answering that question. How would Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister affect your life here in Saskatchewan? Before we start talking about the book, about the biography, Andrew, I just want to start with the latest by-election news out of Ontario. The Conservatives managed to flip a riding that's been a Liberal stronghold since the 80s. So, Andrew, if you are Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, what does this say to you?
Well, it says that the attacks that Poilievre and the Conservatives have been contending with from the Liberals for the last nearly 2 years now are not landing. The Liberals have tried to paint Pierre Poilievre as extreme. There is a lot of suspicion, even from some people in the Conservative leadership race who had backed Jean Charest, that, moderate downtown Toronto Conservatives, the few that there are not going to be able to get behind Poilievre. But it really does neutralize that criticism if he was able to not only maintain but win a riding that the Conservatives have basically written off for the last 30 years.
What calculations do you think went into this by-election? I think, Pierre Poilievre is someone who's very, very intentional, really, I think, was focused on this by-election. And so what do you think were the calculations that the Conservatives made going into this? How do you think what was their strategy to win that?
Well, I think I would go beyond that and talk about the downplaying of expectations, which both the Conservatives and the Liberals did. They both basically were trying to make it out as though they didn't have a hope in heck of winning this thing, so that no matter what, if they lost, they'd be able to say, well, we always thought that was going to happen, and if they win, they get to present it as a triumphant victory. So I think the Conservatives were already very keen on being able to spin whatever happened for a broader narrative. But they really did a lot of work. I know people in that riding, they did a lot of work at just getting out to knock on doors and talk to as many people as possible. And they really just ran a textbook campaign in that riding. And I think that the large Jewish vote that riding has relative to other constituencies in Canada also helped, because there's been that anti-Semitism factor, which in Toronto has turned off a lot of longtime Liberal supporting members of the Jewish community away from the Liberal Party. And I think that certainly contributed to the edge, if not delivered the edge.
Daniel, what's your reaction to those results?
I mean, it's pretty similar. I think we have to be careful over interpreting by-elections. Turnout's always lower. They're not happening during a national campaign, and we know that national campaigns matter. Nonetheless, when you see a result like this in conjunction with the polling numbers that we've seen, which obviously have the Conservatives up by quite a bit, and a government that's been in power for quite some time, all these signs point to a situation where the Liberals are in trouble and the Conservatives are very well positioned. And so, I mean, it kind of fits with, the by-election kind of fits with the general narrative. Maybe it suggests that the Conservatives can reach a little further into Toronto or closer to downtown Toronto than we originally thought. But we'll have to see in the general election whether that continues to be the case.
One of some of the analysis that I heard said, like, they were talking about downtown Toronto with this by-election, whereas in Saskatchewan the Conservatives are a shoo-in. So it's interesting to think about the region that we're talking about with this by-election. On that note, and hearing that analysts say that the Conservatives are a shoo-in in Saskatchewan, I do want to talk about Pierre Poilievre's relationship with people here, but in particular with the Sask Party. So he was the guest speaker at their convention in November. So I just want to play part of the start of his speech because it speaks to his early life and connections to this province.
Who's ready to axe the tax? Who's ready to make common sense common? Who's ready to bring it home for Saskatchewan? Wow, is it ever great to be home on the prairies once again. Thank you very much to Premier Scott Moe for this wonderful invitation. It really does feel like a homecoming, Scott. As you know, my mom and dad were born right here in Saskatchewan. They were raised here, lived there their entire lives, right up into 1977. Mon père vient de Léoville, un village franc-saskoise, un fier village franc-saskoise. Il a transmis ses traditions francophones quand j'étais jeune. Il m'a dit que si j'étais capable de rédiger mon liste de Noël en français, le Père Noël allait être plus généreux. I was just saying in French for those small numbers in the room that didn't understand that. My father, who comes from Leoville, Saskatchewan, used to tell me when I was a kid if I could write my Christmas wish list in French, Santa Claus would be more generous with me. And my mother is from Saskatoon. Anybody here from Saskatoon? So we grew up enjoying summer vacations in Saskatchewan in places like Saskatoon and Unity, where my father's sisters, where my Aunt Rita's from, places like Aberdeen and Dalmany, beautiful farming communities. Of course, we were city kids from Calgary, so we would go and terrorize our farm cousins by taking their .22 rifles out and tearing around on their motorcycles and bouncing on their trampolines and trying to drive their combines very badly. I think they were relieved when we would finally go home, but it was always like Disneyland to be on the farm as a city kid with all these big machines and all of these wonderful adventures and the howling coyotes off in the distance. And so whenever I come back to Saskatchewan and enjoy that big, beautiful sky and incredible sunset, it brings back the best memories of my youth. Now, but for a small act of faith, I might not have been raised in Alberta. I might have been raised here, because I was born in '79, but my folks moved from Saskatchewan to Alberta in '77, 2 years beforehand. And the reason for that was the same reason that everybody was leaving at the time. They were refugees from the NDP, right?
So in just that little bit, there's a lot to talk about, to think about in there. And I'm sure you both heard different things in that tape. I'm so curious to hear both of your perspectives. But Daniel, I want to start with you. What stood out there?
I mean, it's good at playing to a crowd, right? So there's the connect. Poilievre's interesting. He's an MP from Ottawa with roots in Western Canada, can speak French. So he's got different things that he can use to appeal to different parts of the country, which I think works well for the Conservative Party insofar as they need to maintain their prairie base and they need to make gains in Ontario. So even he talked about, played around on the farm, but he's a city kid, right?
Yeah.
So you get this kind of the thing for the base here, right? Farms, rurals, places where the Conservatives do well. And then you get this also, even in that, a note that, he's from the city, right? So this kind of, he can also compete, as we saw in the by-election, in places like Toronto, represents an area like Ottawa. He spoke in French, despite the fact that he's speaking to a crowd in Saskatchewan, which might be a nod to an attempt to win at least some seats in Quebec or expand the base in Quebec. So it's really interesting how he tries to play to these different parts of the country and emphasize different parts of his identity, all of which I think connect with sets of voters that he needs to win.
Yeah, Andrew, that's something that you've written about, right? Like when Pierre Poilievre is in Calgary, he's got a story attached to, that place. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to sort of how he's able to talk to different regions in the country.
Yeah, and it goes back actually to his first campaign, really, when he was running in Nepean Carleton, which is in the suburbs of Ottawa in 2004. And anytime he got to someone at the door, he would tailor his message to who was in front of him. And a lot of people would say, well, that's just standard politics for you, which is true, but he was very good at it. And this was at the time that the Alliance and Progressive Conservative parties had just merged. So there was still a little bit of tension there. If he met someone who had been an Alliance supporter, he would talk about, I worked for Stockwell Day. And if he met someone who had been a traditional PC supporter, he would talk about his connections to that and people on his team that had been involved working for Brian Mulroney. So a lot of it is just him nationalizing what he's always done, which is really show the side of him that the people in that room want or expect. And it's not, I would say, inauthenticity, because these are all legitimate parts of who he is, but it's really a way of trying to say that I've got something for everyone. And the message, interestingly enough, doesn't seem to change in different places. He's not doing what other politicians have been caught by, which is saying something in French and then something that's almost unrecognizable in English. The message is the same, but how he delivers it changes based on where he is and who he's speaking to.
Tell us more about his early life, Andrew, because some people listening may not have known all of those connections to Saskatchewan, and his story is an interesting one. So tell us a little bit more about a young Pierre Poilievre.
His adopted mother, Marlene, had actually volunteered for John Diefenbaker at a certain point. So she had been immersed to some extent into Saskatchewan's politics and politics in the province. And as Poilievre mentioned in the clip you played, his parents, Marlene and Donald, moved to Calgary. They ended up deciding to adopt because they couldn't have a child. And he was biologically the son of an unwed teenage mother in Calgary. So not a conventional story by any stretch, but these two teachers, these, as he says, refugees from NDP Saskatchewan, took him in and gave him what, by all accounts, was a very ordinary upbringing. He was into wrestling. He liked playing hockey. He had all of the social experiences you'd expect a young boy growing up in the 80s to have. But the backdrop of this was obviously a political scene in the province that was changing. And from the time he was 14, he really immersed himself in that and decided to make it his core identity.
Has he always been a politician? What was a young, a slightly older than that, but as he grew up, how did his political life take shape?
He started, what actually happened was he was involved in wrestling in high school and he had tendonitis and had to withdraw. And out of sheer boredom, he started tagging along with his mother to, various political events in Alberta. She was on, I think, the Electoral District Association for the Alberta PC. So he tagged along there, figured he liked it. He tried to get a spot on Preston Manning's board in Calgary Southwest. They didn't have a spot for him, but they didn't want to turn him away. So they connected him with a phone bank the Reform Party was running and said, maybe you can try volunteering there. And Jason Kenney tells a story in the book that I share almost verbatim, in which he hears this voice of this volunteer in his office that's making calls when Kenney was running in 1997 for the first time. And he's picturing this guy who's this lawyer in his 30s or 40s who just has so much confidence, has just such a way with words, is collecting credit card numbers, donations, pledges. And then at the end of the shift, this, scrawny teenager comes out and, says, hi, I'm Pierre Poilievre. And Kenney recounts just being astonished by the natural skill this kid had from such a young age. So to answer your question, he's always had that innate instinct, but he, of course, at first started out as a staffer, a volunteer. He worked on campaigns. He went to Ottawa to intern for the Reform Party. And then once he got there for the first time to work, he pretty much started to plan a political run almost instantly.
I just have a couple of questions before we get to some callers who are waiting to get on the show, and I'm eager to hear what our callers have to say, but just a couple more questions, and one for you, Daniel, because that tape we played from the Sask Party convention, one of the first things we hear is one of Pierre Poilievre's slogans, Axe the Tax. And I think he's got a few of those slogans that people are very familiar with in Saskatchewan. But my question for you, Daniel, is what what's behind some of those messages? How much substance is there behind those slogans with Pierre Poilievre?
Well, I think it depends on the message. Certainly, the Axe the Tax message is substantive, right? The Conservative Party has been running against the carbon tax since the Liberals proposed it in 2008.
Do we know what they would do instead?
So it depends on what you mean by instead, right? They're going to need some kind of, if they're serious about climate change, they're going to need some kind of alternative policy. And I'm not sure they've got, I haven't seen stuff that is particularly convincing as something that would have the same kind of impact. There's a second question of what they're going to do in terms of revenue. If you are going to get rid of a carbon tax, you've got to make up the money somewhere. We've got already a budget deficit being run. And that's something that I don't think any party's given a convincing answer to. If you're going to get rid of a revenue source, how are you going to either replace that revenue source or cut spending to kind of get the budget, to keep the budget at least somewhat close to balanced? There, I'm less convinced that the Conservative Party is a solid answer, and I don't know that any other party has a solid answer either.
Andrew, what do you think? What's the substance behind the slogans that we often hear from Pierre Poilievre?
So he has always had a natural knack for political communications, going back to his fights, as a teen and 20-something in Alberta politics. He was, calling Joe Clark Jurassic Clark and GST Joe and these sorts of nicknames. So he's always got that. But there always is a point underlying it, which is, as was just mentioned, a substantive point. He wants to axe the carbon tax. The way he distills that message down in a snappy way is to axe the tax. And he puts some thought into it. So it's one thing to criticize the slogan, which the Liberals do, and people can decide whether that's the version of politics we want in this country. But he has done a lot of internal contemplation and calculation, people told me, by the time he comes out with one of these things. So it's not done flippantly, would be the takeaway that I'd share.
And what kind of calculations have gone into how he presents himself? We could talk about the glasses, but beyond that, even just how we've gotten to know his family. And I'm wondering what kind of calculations went into to how Pierre Poilievre is presenting himself.
Assume that everything has been run through every conceivable scenario in his mind before he does it. One story that's in the book is where he and his team were discussing whether his wife should be the one to take the stage first when he wins the leadership, which they knew was going to happen, and introduce him, which is normally not done. You'd normally announce the winner and the winner comes out. And instead of just thinking about it for 5 minutes and saying, well, yes, I think Anna should come out, or I don't think Anna should, it became the process of weeks and weeks to which people on his team said, okay, he's kind of overcomplicating something here that doesn't need to be done, which at the end of the day, did it hugely matter? No, she did come out and she gave a great introduction speech, and that was that. But it shows that he really does want to know all the angles. And before he goes into anything, he's done this internal calculation that it doesn't mean he's going to get the outcome right, but it's the chess player in him. He wants to see, if I do this, this is likely to happen, then this. And it's really trying to find a way through these things. But in the end, it, of course, means that you're overcomplicating even the simple.
We're going to get to news here shortly and then the callers, but just as we learn more about the family story, his wife is Venezuelan. They have a child with autism. I've read that in the paper, and I think in the newspaper, and I think I read that in your book, Andrew. But how important is that for people to start to piece together a story of the family and Pierre Poilievre as a family person?
I think so. There's a reason the Conservatives spent millions of dollars running ads that showed him as the dad more than the politician. I think it was last summer, the Who is Pierre Poilievre ads, where he's playing with a puzzle with his son and he's doing these things with his family. I think people want to know that he does have that softer side, which I think doesn't always come across when he's scrapping with journalists or scrapping with Justin Trudeau in the House of Commons. So I think it's a part of who he is. He does have a family, and it seems by all accounts like they're very loving with each other. But he does want to, and the party wants to make sure people are seeing that side of him too. And again, making him more relatable, which his wife's story tremendously does.
Let's leave it for a moment. I have so many more questions. We'll get to it in a bit, and some callers standing by. You are listening to Blue Sky. The question we're asking you is, how would Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister affect your life here in Saskatchewan? We're going to go to Valerie next in Little Pine. Hello, Valerie. Welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi.
What are your thoughts today?
Good morning, or good afternoon, I guess. Yeah, I think he's a car salesman. I mean, he knows how to talk to people and to see their commonality, and he's really smooth that way. He also likes to fight. What worries me about him is what he does when he's Prime Minister. If he is, and I assume he likely will be, but maybe not. Maybe something will happen. I worry about CBC. We need a factual news broadcaster. We need to know the facts, because Pierre Poilievre likes to throw in all this fake stuff that we don't need to hear and many people believe. We need factual, well-balanced news broadcasting. What also concerns me is axing taxes, not just on global warming related taxes, but other taxes, and that has not done us well. Our public education system, our public health system have really suffered. How can I say, our bureaucracy, or might not be the correct word, but we need people in government to check on the quality of our food and the quality of the packaging and on the environment big time. And there doesn't seem to be enough feet on the ground to do that. Our justice system, our court system needs more staffing. All these areas in government need to be supported and brought back to where they used to be way back before all the cuts that I think started with the Stephen Harper regime.
Okay.
So that's a concern of mine, because he's very close to the Harper techniques, and they're scary as shit. Excuse my language. I shouldn't have said that, but they are. And all these things cost money. And just one last thing, the middle class do not need any more taxes, but the corporate taxes, some of them don't exist. And we need to look at a more balanced taxation system. And I'm sure he's not going that direction. So all this really scares me.
Valerie, I appreciate you calling, and you made me smile. So thanks for that. That's Valerie.
You're welcome.
Yeah, take
Bye
care.
now.
Bye. It's Valerie in Little Pine. We've got a few more callers, but I first want to check in with David Shield, who joins us. David, what's making news today?
Well, it looks like there were some tornadoes that came out of those severe storms this weekend. The Northern Tornadoes Project says there was a tornado touchdown in Borden Sunday afternoon and another one in the Humboldt area several hours later. There was no damage and no one was injured. Tomorrow promises to be a tense day at Saskatoon City Council. They'll be talking about changes to zoning, where some areas of the city could be rezoned to increase density. While there has been opposition, one recent U of S grad says more density is needed to increase the number of homes in the city. And thousands of students across the province are getting ready to graduate from high schools this week. However, some students say their school experience was diminished by COVID-19. One student says nothing has gone back to normal since she returned to school after the pandemic. And we'll have a full newscast for you coming up at 1 o'clock.
David, thank you.
You're welcome.
That is the CBC's David Shield. I'm Leisha Grabinski. You are listening to Blue Sky. The question we are asking today, how would Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister affect your life here in Saskatchewan? We are focusing on the leadership of Pierre Poilievre of the Conservative Party today. Tomorrow we'll be talking and taking a closer look at the leadership of Justin Trudeau. And so today, share your thoughts on how you think a Conservative Pierre Poilievre Prime Minister would affect your life here in Saskatchewan. 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. We got an email from Roberta, who writes, "My concern about having Mr. Poilievre as our Prime Minister would be the loss of CBC. What a great loss to Saskatchewan, Canada, and beyond," which is similar to what we heard from Valerie, who just called us. Daniel, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on some of the things we have heard from Pierre Poilievre. What's the possibility of some of the cuts that he's talked about? Just what do you think?
I think he's going to be in a tricky position. I think he has the advantage right now of running from opposition. And so he can kind of grasp onto those things that people are frustrated about without really having to do anything about them, right? So when it comes to cost of living, when it comes to cutting carbon tax, all of those types of things, there are things that he can grasp onto that people are frustrated with. But once he gets if he gets into government, he's going to have to make some difficult choices. And then things like if he wants to cut funding to the CBC, there's a decent contingency of people, I think, like the CBC, and he could run into possible problems there. If he's going to cut other kinds of programs that people benefit from, he's also going to face challenges. And if he's in a situation where he wants to cut taxes but doesn't want to cut programs, then he's going to have to deal with budgets and figure out how to finance things, and that's always challenging. There's an odd parallel here to the British Conservatives and Boris Johnson, who talked about cutting funding to the BBC and had a lot of kind of more populist slogans that tapped into these kinds of things. And I mean, when it came time to governing, Johnson faced a lot of challenges, and he wasn't necessarily able to do all that he'd hoped. And he started to face a lot more backlash when he had to make these kinds of trade-offs and decisions that were going to alienate at least some voters. And the Johnson case is an extreme case where he won by a large margin and didn't make it to the next election because the way that he approached making trade-offs and the way that he approached these decisions caused him a lot of problems. I don't know that Poilievre has... We see those kinds of extremes from Poilievre, but it's certainly a danger that you can put these populist slogans forward. It's hard to hold on to them when you actually have to govern and make decisions.
Well, Andrew, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on all of this, because there was the Pierre Poilievre who was running to be leader of the Conservatives, and some things that he said then. There's the leader of the official opposition and the things he says in that role, and then heading into a general election, and then if he were to be prime minister, so there are probably some different messages depending on where we're at in the arc of politics. And so, Andrew, what do you think?
I mean, what you're saying makes sense, but I'll point out that in Poilievre's case, we really haven't seen that post-leadership pivot that we saw from Aaron O'Toole and Andrew Scheer.
We haven't heard much about Bitcoin, though.
Well, Bitcoin's probably the one exception. He hasn't changed his position on it. He just hasn't been talking about it. But defund the CBC, he was enthusiastic about that in the leadership race, and he's just as enthusiastic now. And it's a line that attracts huge applause from people at his rallies when he says it, because it's still something that he's committing to doing. And I guess I would say he's not leaving himself much wiggle room there, because the thing about slogans is that when they are so clear and simple, it's not something that you can really avoid doing without paying a political price. Axe the tax. It's three simple words. If you don't axe the carbon tax when you get in, people can say, well, why didn't you do it? Same as defund the CBC. Now, I will say there is some question about what exactly that would look like. For example, he has spoken about carve-outs for perhaps French language programming. I don't know if radio would be protected and just TV would get the axe. It's not quite clear. But what we do know is that, CBC has been a thorn in the side Conservatives feel for quite some time. And this is the sort of stuff that Conservatives have often talked about, but he's actually talking about doing it now, which is putting him in a very different category.
I'm speaking today with Andrew Lawton, managing editor of True North, former host on Global News Radio, and also wrote a book, Pierre Poilievre, A Political Life, that explores the almost 2 decades Poilievre spent as an MP before becoming Conservative leader. And with me here in our Saskatoon studio is U of S political science professor Daniel Westlake. We are asking you, what would your life look like here in Saskatchewan if Pierre Poilievre were to be Prime Minister? You can call 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Now let's hear how some of you are answering that question. We've got Perry in Prince Albert on the line. Hello, Perry. Welcome to Blue Sky.
Hello. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. What are your thoughts?
I think Poilievre is going to do a wonderful job, not just for Saskatchewan. I think Canada, we need to wake up, man. Since COVID, we fell asleep. The whole workforce is, some of us are working from home, others are not. We really got to get back to work. Canada's a working country. We were built on hard work, hard labor, and we have that attitude in our blood. But, if we start resting on our laurels and we get used to, just kind of laying back, our whole country is going to become, basically a struggling social welfare state. And I think under Trudeau is starting to cut that.
Oh, Perry.
I think he got lazy. I think
it's windy.
I think he started. Yeah, I think he started good, but he's ended very poorly. So I think Poilievre will give us a really good start again, and exactly what Canada needs. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for calling. We lost you a little bit there with it sounded like some wind, but then you were loud and clear at the very end. So that was Perry joining us. We've got Robert on the line in Saskatoon. Hello, Robert.
Hello, how are you? I'm kind of two words there. Harperite. I think Poilievre is a Harperite, and that means very right-wing, almost fascist policies. Remember what Rob Nicholson did to our country, and well, you got to think about Jim Flaherty, too. And then as far as it goes, my question is, did Poilievre ever work between high school and university, say, and between university and becoming what was he first, somebody on a school board, and then from a school board he became a member of parliament, and right now we're paying those people $212,000 plus an equal allowance. So, I mean, $400,000 for 333 people, can they pare that down? I'd be all for it. But I don't think Poilievre's ever worked. So I don't think he has a lot of any kind of reality checks that go on with the rest of us. I mean, we all work for the government and we all work for the banks. So, I mean, who does the government work for? The banks. So Poilievre, therefore, works for the banks. Have a good day. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for calling, Robert. Andrew, I'll ask you that. Has Pierre Poilievre ever had a job before getting into politics or anything other than politics, Andrew?
Yes and no. He never really had a career outside of politics. His first job was working in an MP's office, so he was employed not as a politician, but he was in politics. He did start a business with one of his friends that was doing campaign services across the country. So again, in the political realm, but it was private sector. And then he ended up working on Parliament Hill for Stockwell Day before he ran. So he has had jobs, but very much a political tinge to all of them.
The caller used the term Harperite. You write about Poilievre's work behind the scenes during the Harper years with Conservative MPs to solidify certain values and principles. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was kind of funny, and I learned about it in the course of interviewing people for the book, MPs particularly. There was, after Harper was elected in 2006, so this was Poilievre's second term, it was in government with a minority, and a bunch of the more conservative members of the caucus, in particular those from Saskatchewan, Alberta, had formed a little group that would meet the day before the national caucus meetings. And they called themselves jokingly the Khmer Bleu, which is a play on the Khmer Rouge from Cambodia, because, blue is the color of the Tories. And their agenda was basically to make sure that in the caucus meetings, they were always putting forward a conservative priority list for Harper to take up. And they wanted to really push back against the Quebec caucus, which were always the squeaky wheels, and some of the red Tories. And Andrew Scheer, Saskatchewan MP elected alongside Poilievre, was a part of this group. He had also found before then, after 2004, a fair bit of kinship with Jeremy Harrison, who's now, of course, a minister in the Saskatchewan government. But really, the Khmer Bleu, one of their big claims to fame, they say, is getting Harper to lower the GST to 5%. So he had originally campaigned on bringing it to 6%. They pushed behind the scenes to get a further reduction. And that was them saying that we were pushing a fiscally conservative vision within the mechanisms of government and caucus. And Poilievre was very much a central player in that.
I want to share another email from Anna, who writes, I likely wouldn't have to buy small garbage bags, referring to the plastic bag ban. And I think the Conservatives plan to repeal that. But I would likely would not have received a $5,000 grant for my new heat pump. I think Pierre Poilievre would ultimately remove any progress we've made towards reducing climate change. Daniel, you've talked a little bit about this. I'm just wondering if you want to comment on that email.
I mean, I guess I'd say Poilievre is a conservative, right? And that has implications for climate change, it has implications for a range of other things. At the same time, governing is tricky, right? You can't just remove policies by snapping your fingers, right? And you have to deal with the ramifications of removing those policies. And so I think Poilievre certainly will matter if he gets elected, and we'll see a certain different orientation towards government. But it's not going to be next day we suddenly lose the carbon tax and lose a lot of progress on climate change. it'll be a slow undoing of some policy outcomes. And in some cases, they may find that it's too complicated to do things that they thought they could do fairly easily. And so it's when you get into government, things are always a little bit more trickier and a little bit more complicated than I think politicians sometimes realize when they're sitting on opposition benches.
Let's go to another caller. Joel in Saskatoon joins us right now. Hi, Joel.
Not so bad.
What are your thoughts today?
How you feel? Well, actually, I think, this political guy, there's a lot of them out there trying to do their job the best they can, and sometimes people realize they don't, because political servitude is one thing. You can say one thing, do another, and either act upon it, be upon it, or just don't, just say you're going to do something and not do something. I mean, there's a lot of things they can actually take care of, but it's just pretty much terrible. And then that's an economic thing. Conservatives have always been for more for the business people than for the small guy. And that's the people who work. And they're the ones who pay the taxes. They're the ones who pay the bills. And they're the ones who should be looked at and talked to specifically. And it's not so much of a, vote me kind of thing. It's just do something or do it right. That's it's got to be that way, hopefully. And then, at some point in time, it'll come to it. I'm betting on that.
Okay.
It would be nice.
Joel, thanks for calling. Appreciate it. It's Joel in Saskatoon. Got an email from Ed who writes, well, Pierre Poilievre will be a breath of fresh air compared to these socialist dreamers. They are trying to turn us into China. Freeland has the country so far in debt, and her children's grandchildren will never pay the debt off. Good riddance will be a welcome relief from Trudeau's policies. They are so far left, they're bordering on communism. The faster we get rid of them, the better off the country will be. That comes to us from Ed. You can email us to bluesky@cbc.ca. You can also call us and answer this question. How would Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister affect your life here in Saskatchewan? 1-800-716-2221. Again, you can email bluesky@cbc.ca. Daniel, I'm wondering if Saskatchewan's support is for some of the support we're hearing, if it's for Pierre Poilievre or just the Conservatives in general. And I ask you that because we've had other Saskatchewan folks run for the federal Conservative leadership, including Andrew Scheer. So will Saskatchewan voters support the federal Conservatives no matter who's running or leading?
Most seats probably. Leaders do matter, and kind of having a popular leader will increase a party's vote share in Saskatchewan, just like in any other province. At the same time, when we talk about Saskatchewan, we talk about a province that is more rural than most provinces outside of Atlantic Canada. We're talking about a province that depends a lot on resource revenue, that is fairly wealthy relative to other provinces, at least if you look at things like GDP per capita, and is a bit socially conservative, right? And these are all things that we would expect to lead a province to vote more conservative, and they all happen to be true about Saskatchewan. So I think regardless of who the Conservatives have as their leader, they're probably in really good shape in Saskatchewan. They're probably going to win a large share of the riders. They may not win all of them. There's a couple that are always a bit competitive. Could Poilievre, if he's particularly popular or well-liked, bump the vote share by a little bit? Yeah, probably. I don't know that it changes the outcome, though, with respect to the seats that the Conservatives take out of the province, though.
Andrew, I've got a question for you because Pierre Poilievre is often criticized by Liberals and others for having social conservative views on issues like abortion or gay marriage, but he appears to have made no big leadership promises to the social conservative wing of his party, and there's nothing in his core political message that seems to touch on these issues. So how should people view Pierre Poilievre in terms of social conservatism, do you think?
Well, not only has he not made any particular promises or overtures to social conservatives, but I'd say he's gone the other way by being unequivocal as recently as, I think, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago and saying, we are not going to touch the abortion issue. Now, I should say social conservatives have broader items on their agenda than that. I think on, assisted dying, this is an area where the conservatives have been very uncomfortable with the expansion to people with mental illness. So I think there are things where obviously social conservatives will be able to advance things they care about. But on, the big two that people tend to view in line with that, abortion and gay marriage, he said absolutely status quo will remain under him. And I would just point out as well that if you look to his leadership election, he is the first of the last three leaders to not owe his victory to social conservatives. Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole were elected entirely because the Conservatives have a ranked ballot for their leaderships. And it was social conservative votes that ended up going to them that clinched the victory for both of them. Whereas Poilievre won on the first ballot. He didn't actually have to do that really niche campaigning to go after individual groups, let alone social conservatives in the party.
Yeah, if I can.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are.
I think the other thing to remember here is social conservatives don't have anywhere else to go, right? If you're concerned about the Conservatives not being socially conservative enough, you're not going to go vote for the Liberals or the NDP.
Well, some went PPC last time, though.
Yeah, so I think the other thing, though, to remember here is that the anger and frustration with the Liberal Party, I think, is higher than in previous elections. And so the impetus to strategic vote is going to be higher. It's one thing after 4 or 6 years of Liberal government to turn around and say, you know, I'm not really happy with the Conservatives. I'm going to stay home, or I'm going to vote for the PPC. After 8, it becomes more challenging, right? And we saw the reverse in Alberta provincial politics, where the Alberta Conservatives have been in office so long, people started to move off to the Wild Rose Alliance. As soon as the NDP gets into power, they very quickly find a way to work together.
They regroup.
Yeah, because losing and being frustrated sometimes pushes people to make strategic decisions that they might not otherwise make. And so I think Poilievre's in a better position than O'Toole and Scheer was to hold on to those social conservative votes without having to give them as much as maybe they were expecting from Scheer or O'Toole.
Interesting. Okay, let's go to another caller. Ralph in Cabri joins us right now. Hello, Ralph.
Oh, hi. Good show. Yeah, I think people are voting, or will be voting for Poilievre, but without knowing much about him, unless things can get cleared. But I guess I'm not in favor of him. He's too far to the right, and like somebody else said, he's been collecting a full pension since he's 31 years old. Never had a job. He's basically he's too far into the reform Harperite type conservatives. I would go for a progressive conservative government, but these guys aren't that. And I worry that they're great at drive-by smears, but that's a whole different thing if you're elected and you have to govern. Because I don't see anybody in their party that has potentially good policy making. And I mean, I look at the fellow who's the financial critic against Chrystia Freeland, who is a very smart lady. The conservative fellow, he's went to community college and he's got some little certificate. Like, people are voting for something. They're just so upset with Trudeau for some reason that they're willing to jump out of the frying pan and into the fire. Anyways, that's all I got to say.
Well, thanks for calling, Ralph. I appreciate it. That was Ralph in Cabri. We've got Beverly on the line in Lashburn. Hello, Beverly. Welcome to Blue Sky.
Hello. I think comparing what's happened in history in our province, that we're going back to the Bennett buggy. So I hope you can all get horses to pull your cars. It was really bad in the 30s, and I can't see anything else happening with our present economic system unless they get busy and really clean up and make a fair and progressive tax system which taxes all profit and income instead of just what the working people get. When you've got banks that are making record profits and only paying about 12% of that profit as income tax, whereas a guy who's, cutting grass for a city or whatever, he's paying 35 or 40%. Where is the justice or fairness in that? I just can't see any. And all the subsidies, et cetera, except for a few very small ones, which they talk about a lot, are going to the rich. Oil companies get huge subsidies because, after all, they need record profits. To me, it's just a complete mess in our whole economic system and practice. And I think we should listen to people like Yanis Varoufakis, who had to face this in Greece, and where banks in Europe virtually destroyed the Greek country. It really is bothering me that we're not taking this into account.
Beverly, I appreciate you picking up the phone and calling. Good to hear from you today. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's Beverly in Lashburn. We've got a couple minutes. We could squeeze in another call or two, maybe. 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. The question we've been asking today, how would Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister affect your life here in Saskatchewan? Tomorrow we are focusing on the legacy, the leadership of Justin Trudeau. So there'll be more time to call tomorrow and comment on politics. But today we've been focusing on Pierre Poilievre as leader of the Conservatives, who obviously wants to be Prime Minister. Rick emails, a Poilievre government would be changing or reducing of CPP, OAS, pharmacare, dental plan. I do not understand what it means to reduce payroll tax that funds all of the above. Barbara writes, the carbon tax is only a wealth distribution. If the carbon tax actually did something for the environment, that would be more helpful. The federal government workforce under Trudeau has doubled, and yet the service level has decreased. The waste in the federal government is shameful, yet bonuses are being handed out. The current national debt will bankrupt Canada. Remember what happened to Greece when they went bankrupt. We cannot continue to spend money we don't have. As far as the CBC is concerned, the frustration lies with the CBC receiving government funding and then handing out bonuses. Now, a note from CBC on the bonuses. A release criticizing bonuses at a public institution is certainly attention-grabbing to most people. A bonus sounds like an extra, especially at a publicly funded institution. This is the statement, I think this is from CBC. CBC, my producer will correct me if I'm misinterpreting what this is. CBC Radio Canada does not pay bonuses. Those management positions were eligible to receive what is called performance pay. It is not an extra, but a portion of their compensation that is held back until the end of the fiscal year and then determined based on individual and corporate performance against a specific set of indicators, which are established at the start of each year. We're always open to hearing what you have to say. If you didn't get on today, you can call our talkback, and it might be a good one to play for our guest tomorrow, who's written a book about Justin Trudeau. Our talkback number is 1-800-661-7540. This has been fun. I'm like, what did we leave out? What have we not gotten to yet? We're out of time, but it's been just wonderful being able to have this conversation. I can give you each like 10 seconds if you want to sum up the final thoughts that are swirling in your head, Daniel.
We've got another year to the next election, so we'll have lots of time to talk. But
that's true.
You can hear the polarization, though, and that will be an interesting to watch play out.
Yeah.
Poilievre probably doesn't need more than 40% of the vote. If he can get 40% of the population polarized towards his side, that probably is a majority government for him. So it's be interesting to see how the polarization and the views that are expressed on him evolve over the next year.
Andrew, do you have 10 seconds of thoughts that you want to share before we say goodbye?
Just a bit of fun trivia. You played the clip from his speech to the Saskatchewan Party Convention. That same weekend was the Alberta UCP Convention, which also invited him to speak, and he chose your province. So take from that what you will. But he had to pick Saskatchewan or Alberta, and he went Saskatchewan.
Oh, that's interesting.
Certainly, yeah, very much.
But you're kind of like your brow is a bit.
But he did have both.
You're confused, Daniel, by that choice. Well, we have to leave it there. Big thanks to both of you for being our guests today on Blue Sky. Andrew Lawton, managing editor of True North, former host on Global News Radio, and wrote the book Pierre Poilievre: A Political Life. Also, Daniel Westlake was one of our guests today in our Saskatoon studio, a U of S political science professor. I'm Leisha Grabinski. You've been listening to Blue Sky here on CBC Radio 1. We got a ton of emails. We couldn't get to all the calls, but tomorrow we are focusing on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So more to get to tomorrow right here on CBC Radio 1.